Back in Queen Charlotte Sound, the familiar bay seemed to promise shelter, food and recovery. But beneath the calm return to New Zealand lay rumors of violence, uneasy encounters, and a truth the crew did not yet fully understand. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. In this podcast, I explore historical journeys and travel accounts that shaped how Europeans came to understand the world. This series follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the young naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century. What happened in the last episode? After leaving New Caledonia, the expedition was weakened by illness and short on provisions, struggling to maintain even the most basic routines at sea. They followed the reef-lined coast, but calms repeatedly set them drifting toward dangerous waters. Land was often close, yet rarely within reach, and brief landings brought only limited relief. Strange column-like forests appeared along the shore, and new islands rose from the horizon, without offering real security. Hunger steadily worsened, forcing the crew to rely on whatever they could catch. Only after days of uncertainty did a steady wind return, finally carrying them away to the south. Monday, October 17th, 1774, coast of New Zealand.
Accompanied by dolphin-fish, petrels, and albatrosses, the travelers continued sailing with such favorable wind that by early morning the coast of New Zealand lay before them. Already 2 nights earlier, they had felt heavy evening dew, always a sure sign that land is near. The part of New Zealand now in sight was Mount Egmont, an astonishingly high peak on the northern side of the entrance to Cook Strait. Its upper section was covered with snow and ice nearly halfway down. The summit could only occasionally be seen, as it was usually shrouded in clouds. The whole mountain presented a majestic sight, and the nearby peaks seemed like small hills in comparison. It rose from a wide plain, or rather merged gradually into it, with its highest point ending in a very narrow tip. Judging by the area covered by snow, this mountain had to be nearly as high as the summit of Mount Tide on Tenerife. The previously mild wind suddenly turned into a storm that drove the ship forward more than 8 nautical miles in a single hour. The air became rough and cold, and the thermometer dropped to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. On the west coast of New Zealand, this wind was favorable for the sailors. On the east coast, however, as last year's experience had shown, it could have been dangerous. The next morning, the storm drove them past Cape Stevens, Admiralty Bay, and Point Jackson, finally bringing them into Queen Charlotte Sound, where the mountains offered some shelter. For the 3rd time on this voyage, they reached their former anchorage in Ship Cove. The sight of the familiar coasts and mountains, wild and desolate as they may have seemed, sparked joy. The hope of regaining strength and restoring the crew's health spread throughout the ship. The weather at their arrival, however, was not very welcoming. Heavy rain and strong gusts, and the season offered little charm in this harsh climate. Some trees still bore autumn leaves. Only a few signs of spring could be seen. In the afternoon, Some men rowed ashore to the spot where the tents had stood during the 2 previous visits. They wanted to see if the bottle with the letter to Captain Furneaux, buried there, was still present. Upon landing, they found a tree where shags were nesting, at first a sign that no humans had been there for a long time. But just a few steps further, they saw clear traces of European presence since their last stay in November. Felled trees, saw marks, and tools unknown to the Maori. The bottle was also gone. The gardens they had planted earlier had grown wild. Much had been pulled up, and the rest was overgrown with weeds, which grew lushly in the loose soil. During this exploration, sailors tried fishing with a large seine net, but without success. Those fishing from the ship with a line had better luck, catching, among others, an 11-pound snapper, Sparus pagris. At sunset, Cook ordered a cannon to be fired, perhaps to alert the locals to their arrival. Early the next morning, they moved the ship farther into the bay and moored it close to shore at 9 o'clock. The weather was milder, and the tents were once again pitched in the old spot. The young birds from the previous year, still unafraid of firearms, were easily shot, a welcome addition for both the kitchen and the collection. In the afternoon, Cook went with some men to the nearby Cannibal Cove, where celery and scurvy grass grew in abundance. For Cook, it was a principle to collect such healthy plants for the crew. While the sailors were occupied with that task, the others found a cabbage palm, Areca oleracea, in the forest, the same kind they had previously seen on Norfolk Island. In this, for their standards, cold land, the discovery of a cabbage palm came as a surprise to the expedition, and was clear proof that this type of palm had to be far more resistant than all other species. Toward evening, they returned with a boatload of anti-scorbutic herbs, which were useful to everyone, but particularly welcome to those weakened by eating the poisonous fish. They fully expected that taking this blood-cleansing remedy would restore their health and strength. At sunset, a cannon was again fired, as not a single local had yet appeared. The following day, a violent storm broke out, made even colder by the wind blowing down from the high, snow-covered Alps. Toward evening, heavy rain set in, alternating with thick fog, and lasted a full 24 hours. Afterward, a northwesterly wind rose, quickly clearing the weather again. On October 22nd, the sun rose in radiant splendor beneath a cloudless sky. The song of countless birds was heard for the first time since their arrival, heralding a beautiful spring day. All the officers hurried out together to hunt, while Captain Cook, Georg, and several companions took a boat along the coast as far as Point Jackson. They landed in several small coves. In the afternoon, they made a detour to Hippa Rock and lit a fire there to attract the locals with this signal. They then visited the kitchen garden they had planted earlier on Motu Aro, but found that all the plants had withered, and most of the seeds had been eaten by birds. Toward evening, the officers returned to the ship after a very successful hunt. The sailors, too, had not been idle in the meantime, and brought back plenty of fresh herbs and a good amount of fish. This shared success gave rise to a kind of celebration throughout the ship, during which the crew's cheerful lightheartedness made all past hardships momentarily forgotten. After waiting another day in vain for the Maori to appear, they decided to seek them out themselves in the bays farther to the south. On the morning of October 24th, preparations began. Before long, 2 sailing canoes appeared at the entrance to Ship Cove. The expedition assumed the boats were coming because of them, but as soon as the crews spotted the ship, they lowered their sails and paddled away in great haste. This shyness, uncharacteristic for the locals, only made the crew more curious to speak with the people and find out the reason for their distrust. Captain Cook went with Georg and others in his boat to Ship Cove. There, they shot numerous oyster-catchers and shags, which were present in great numbers. Of Maori, however, they found no sign. Just as they were about to turn back, they heard a voice from the southern shore. Looking more closely, they saw several people on the higher hills. On a small wooded knoll stood another 3 or 4, and not far off lay several huts among the trees, with canoes pulled up on the beach. There they went ashore. The Maori hesitated for a while, unsure whether to respond to the Europeans' waving invitation, until one of them finally found the courage. As soon as he touched noses with the European, the local custom of greeting in peace, his companions followed, as did the others who had remained on the high ridges. All of them wore old, worn-out straw cloaks. Their hair hung wildly around their heads, and their uncleanliness could be smelled from a distance. Among them, there were no more than 3 or 4 whom the Europeans recognized. When these men revealed their identities, the visitors also remembered other former acquaintances and asked after their well-being. The answer was so confused that they couldn't clearly understand it. One thing, however, became obvious. The locals spoke of a battle and mentioned that several of their tribespeople had been killed. They repeatedly asked whether the Europeans were still well disposed toward them and whether their demonstrations of friendship were genuine. Both these questions and their visible unease led the visitors to suspect that they had gotten into a conflict with the crew of a European ship. Immediately, they thought of the Adventure, the second vessel of the expedition. For the time being, however, they did not let on, but instead tried to gain the people's trust. They shifted the conversation to trading fish. The thought of bartering suddenly made the Maori very open. They ran to their canoes, removed the mats covering them, and brought out a large quantity of freshly caught fish. In exchange for a little Tahitian cloth, some nails, medals, and small pieces of red fabric, they gave so many fish that the entire crew had a full meal. A middle-aged man, apparently the leader of the group, introduced himself as Piteré and proved especially friendly. His companions soon followed his example and eventually became so trusting that they promised to come aboard the next morning. With that promise, the 2 groups parted ways. The Europeans admired the characteristic courage of these people, who completely rejected the idea of hiding from an enemy and, just like once in Dusky Bay, now again stepped forward voluntarily, despite their concern and the clear superiority of the foreigners. Nevertheless, as would later become clear, they had more than enough reason to fear European revenge. Piteré and his companions kept their word. They arrived at sunrise the next morning in 5 canoes and sold a large quantity of tasty fish, immediately restoring the abundance on the crew's tables. Once the fish trade was concluded, they brought out various pieces of green nephrite. Some worked into chisels, others into ornaments, to trade for Tahitian cloth, English fabric, or iron goods. When no one wanted any more of these items, they paddled back to shore. There, part of the crew was busy fetching water, chopping wood, and doing similar work, while Mr. Wales had set up his observatory. The Maori again offered their valuables, and eventually spent the night on the nearby beach. The next morning, they went fishing again for the expedition and supplied the Europeans so generously each day that there was always a stock of fresh provisions. They preferred staying near the workers on the beach, as some of the Marines especially enjoyed talking with them for hours, as far as their grasp of the language allowed. This close contact soon made the Maori so open-hearted that they told their new European friends a story that caught everyone's attention. Some time ago, a foreign ship had anchored here, and its entire crew had been killed and eaten by the locals during a battle. This news was horrifying enough to cause great concern, particularly since there was reason to fear that the Adventure might be the ship in question. To learn more, the Europeans asked for details and soon uncovered more and more clues that all but confirmed their suspicion. Eventually, the Maori realized how deeply the foreigners cared about the subject and refused to share more information. They even threatened one of their own, who was about to recount the whole story again in full. Captain Cook now became all the more curious to learn something reliable about the fate of the Adventure. He had Piteré and another Maori called into the cabin and tried to explain himself as clearly as possible. Both men, however, denied that anything at all had happened to the Europeans, but it remained uncertain whether they had truly understood the question. To bring clarity, the Europeans cut two pieces of paper into the shape of ships, one representing the Resolution, the other the Adventure. Then they drew the layout of the harbor on a larger sheet and moved the ships in and out of it as often as they had anchored and departed, right up to their last departure in November. At that point, they paused briefly, then began to draw the Resolution back into the harbor again. But the Maori interrupted them, pushed the ship of the Resolution aside, and pulled the Adventure into the harbor and then back out again. While doing so, they counted on their fingers how many months had passed since that ship had sailed. In this way, the Europeans learned, with double joy, not only that their former companions had indeed departed from here, but also that the locals possessed a degree of sharpness and reasoning, which, if properly nurtured, promised everything. The only mystery that remained was how to reconcile the first statement about a battle between Maori and Europeans with the later assurance that no harm had come to their countrymen and that the Adventure had departed. But as people tend to believe what they wish, they eventually consoled themselves with the thought that the first part of the story must have been based on a misunderstanding. It wasn't until their return to the Cape of Good Hope that they learned the truth. The Adventure had lost a boat and 10 men during its last stay in New Zealand. Georg later learned the details from the survivors of the Adventure after his return to England and supplemented this with the accounts of the Maori. After Captain Fourneau had become separated from the Resolution due to storm and fog, he anchored in Tolaga Bay on November 9, 1773. On November 16th, he set sail again and reached Queen Charlotte Sound on November 30th, just a few days after the Resolution had departed. Omai, the Tahitian companion from Raiatea aboard the Adventure, later told Georg in England that he had been the first to discover the inscription on the tree, beneath which the bottle with the message about their departure was buried. The bottle was dug up and the letter delivered, after which preparations for departure were immediately made. Shortly before leaving, Captain Fourneau sent a boat to Grass Cove to fetch a load of scurvy grass and celery. The command was given to Mr. Rowe. This young man, though he had promising qualities, had not yet overcome the prejudices of his naval training, and regarded the people of the South Seas with a certain contempt. His men landed in Grass Cove and began collecting herbs. Presumably, to work more comfortably, they had taken off their jackets. The Maori of Queen Charlotte Sound later reported that the conflict arose when one of their people stole a jacket. In response, the Europeans had immediately opened fire until they ran out of gunpowder. Then the locals rushed at them and killed every last one. Georg recalled that Rowe had often claimed the Maori would not stand up to musket fire if it ever came to a fight. Already in Tolaga Bay, he had expressed a wish to shoot at locals when they stole a small cask of brandy, something he only refrained from doing due to the insistence of Lieutenant Burney. When the boat failed to return after 2 full days, Furneaux sent Lieutenant Burney in an armed boat to search for it. At the entrance to Cannibal Bay, he spotted a large canoe full of Maori, who immediately jumped into the water and swam ashore as soon as they saw the adventure's boat. This unusual flight struck Burney as suspicious. In the now empty canoe, he sadly found clear traces of what had happened. Torn limbs of his comrades and pieces of their clothing. Later in Grass Cove, they encountered numerous Maori ready for battle. People crowded on a nearby hill, and smoke rose from many places, suggesting that the flesh of the slain men was already being prepared for a feast. This sight filled even the toughest sailors with horror, and then with a thirst for revenge. They opened fire, killed many, and drove the survivors from the beach. They destroyed the canoes, went ashore, and searched the huts. There they found bundles of scurvy grass, likely already collected by the victims, and baskets full of dismembered body parts, including what was unmistakably Rowe's hand. On the beach, dogs were gnawing on entrails. Only a few pieces of the boat remained. Burney assumed the Maori had smashed it to retrieve the nails. The unfortunate men had probably left the boat on dry land at low tide, thus depriving themselves of their last means of escape. After this heavy loss, made even more painful for Furneaux by the fact that Rowe was a relative, he set sail from Queen Charlotte Sound on December 22nd, passed Cape Horn without stopping anywhere, and reached the Cape of Good Hope on March 19th, 1774. From there, he returned to England and arrived in Spithead on July 15th, precisely at the time when the Resolution was exploring the New Hebrides on the other side of the globe. The inhabitants of New Zealand had always been dangerous enemies to all who came to them. The first discoverer of this land, the Dutchman Abel Jansen Tasman, lost 4 sailors at an anchorage he then named Murderer's Bay because of the incident. It is likely the same bay that Captain Cook later called Blind Bay. The locals carried off one of the slain sailors, so they had already known since 1642 what the flesh of a European tasted like. The English had already been treated harshly by them, as previously described, but the French had suffered even worse than all others. They killed and ate Monsieur Dufresne Marion, along with 28 of his men. Mr. Crozet, a French artillery officer who happened to be anchored at the Cape of Good Hope on a journey to East India, when Georg arrived there, told him the tragic fate that had befallen Marion. Mr. Crozet had served as second officer aboard the royal ship Mascarin under Captain Marion. Together with a consort ship, they anchored in the northern part of New Zealand, in the Bay of Islands. A storm had caused major damage to the masts, and Crozet had to search the forests for replacements. He did find suitable trees, but it seemed almost impossible to get them from the mountains down to the water. However, as necessity knows no law, Crozet had a path cleared through dense forest for about 5.5 kilometers, all the way to the suitable logs. While this arduous work continued, some of the men set up tents on a small island to more conveniently fetch drinking water and gather firewood. They had already spent 39 days there and had gained the locals' trust to such a degree that the Maori began insistently offering them their girls. One day, Captain Marion went ashore with several companions to visit the various work parties. First, he checked on the men filling the water barrels. Then he intended to go to the carpenters working in the forest under Crozet's supervision. But first, as was his usual habit, he stopped at the local fortress which lay along the path. There, he and his entire party must have perished, for they were never heard from again. The officer on duty aboard ship was puzzled when Marion did not return that evening, but reassured himself with the thought that the captain had been obliged to spend the night on land. The next morning, he unsuspectingly sent a group of sailors to cut wood on a beach beyond a headland marked on Cook's map. There, a party of locals launched a surprise attack from an ambush and killed all but one sailor, who ran across the headland, threw himself into the sea, and swam back to the ships despite several spear wounds. He was pulled aboard, and his story spread horror. Crozet was meanwhile still in the forest with the carpenters, and at risk of meeting the same fate as his countrymen. A corporal with 4 Marines was immediately dispatched, and boats were ordered to wait by the infirmary tents for Crozet. The corporal reached him, and thanks to good precautions, Crozet and his men made it safely to the rendezvous point. There, however, a large crowd of festively adorned locals had gathered, including several chiefs, a clear sign they were preparing for battle. Crozet ordered his 4 sharpshooters to stay ready to fire at any moment. He had the tents taken down and all equipment brought to the boats, while the workers followed one after another. Crozet himself approached the highest-ranking chief with the sharpshooters. The chief stated that one of their leaders had killed Marion. Crozet gave no reply, but forcefully drove a stake into the ground directly at the man's feet and ordered him not to come any closer. This boldness so stunned the crowd that they obeyed his command and sat down. Only once all the men were in the boats did the sharpshooters follow, and Crozet boarded last. Hardly had they pushed off when the New Zealanders began a war chant and hurled stones, but the sailors rowed quickly out of range. After this incident, the locals repeatedly attempted to wipe out the French completely. A nighttime attack on the men stationed on the island failed because they were alert. Later, the Maori launched a coordinated assault with over 100 large, heavily manned canoes on both ships, but were driven back by artillery fire. Since peaceful repairs of the ships were no longer possible, Crozet decided to attack the locals' large, well-fortified hippa. There, the French encountered a large number of defenders on wooden battle platforms behind palisades. Constant volleys of gunfire soon forced the defenders to flee the platforms and take cover behind the palisades. Carpenters breached an opening, but the chiefs defended this narrow entrance with great bravery. 8 of them fell at that spot before the rest fled, many of them being cut down as they retreated. Crozet offered a reward of 50 thalers for a live prisoner, but no one was able to capture one. A soldier who seized an old man was bitten so violently in the hand that he stabbed the man to death with his bayonet in rage. In the conquered hippa, the French found large amounts of cloth, weapons, tools, raw flax, and stores of dried fish and roots, presumably intended for the winter. This bloody action spread such terror that Crozet was able to complete the ship repairs without interference, and, after 64 days, left the Bay of Islands. In this conflict with the French, the New Zealanders would appear in a very poor light, if one did not assume that something must have happened beforehand that gravely offended and angered them. Their otherwise observable behavior toward Europeans made it clear that they were neither deceitful nor hostile to people in general. Thus, it could be supposed that the French, perhaps without realizing it, had given them a reason that, in the eyes of the locals, justified their violent revenge, as one might expect from uncivilized peoples. Georg and his companions had all the more reason to believe the reports from the people in Queen Charlotte Sound, since these locals openly accused one of their own of theft. At the same time, they clearly explained that the Europeans' hasty reaction to punish the theft immediately with musket fire, possibly without distinguishing between the thief and the whole group present, had enraged their tribesmen and incited them to seek vengeance. Every human being is destined to live out their appointed time on earth. If someone tries to end that life prematurely, it can be seen as a violation of the Creator's laws. The Creator has given humans passions as protective instincts, and the urge for revenge is primarily meant to repel violent oppression. The savage feels this instinct and grants himself the right to avenge the insults he suffers. In civil society, on the other hand, this task is reserved for certain individuals who also bear the duty to punish wrongdoing. Yet even in the civilized countries of Europe, this form of justice is not always sufficient. For example, when the guardian of public order himself violates the rights of the community, do not all civil obligations cease? In such a case, must not each person defend their own natural rights and allow their passions, the original tools of self-preservation, free rein once again? Even in private life, there are many cases in which this natural, not blameworthy feeling of revenge can be useful, even in a well-ordered state. There are numerous forms of harm, insult, or defamation for which no law offers protection. It happens often enough that the powerful possess enough influence to twist the laws and act to the disadvantage of the poor, defenseless person. Such cases would occur far more often and lead to extreme acts of violence, if not for the fear that the wronged individual might someday reclaim the right to protect himself and his property, a right he had previously entrusted to others. Once he sees that those responsible have shamefully failed in their duty. If a thief attacks my property, I do not have to run to a judge first. In many cases, I may punish the offender on the spot. In this way, cane and sword have often kept wrongdoers in check who would otherwise have defied the law.
End of October 1774, Ship Cove, Queen Charlotte Sound, South Island of New Zealand.
The words and unmistakable signs of Piteré had by now completely reassured Georg and his companions that the adventure had departed safely. On a fine day, the captain organized a trip into the innermost part of West Bay to see whether the pigs and chickens, which had been released the previous year in this uninhabited place, had survived and multiplied so successfully that one might one day expect large herds. The landing was made at the same spot as before, but on the beach there was neither a trace of the animals nor any sign that a human had been there for a long time. It could therefore be assumed that the animals had retreated deep into the forest and would multiply there undisturbed. On the return journey, the group encountered several families of natives on the opposite shore of the bay, who gave them a large quantity of fish. After this small excursion, the weather remained so stormy and rainy that Georg and his companions could not go ashore again until November 2nd, this time to Grass Cove. Without the slightest idea of the sad incident that had taken place in this very bay, they landed in all the nearby little coves, each one going far inland without caution. In the woods on the hills, many footpaths crossed, yet there was no trace of any inhabitants. On this expedition, they shot more than 30 birds, including a dozen wild pigeons that fed on the leaves and seeds of a beautiful large tree, Sophora microphylla. At 8 o'clock in the evening, they returned to the ship. In the meantime, a large group of natives had arrived from another part of the bay. Instead of fish, as usually brought by Piteré's people, they came with only garments, weapons, and other special items to sell. However, since this kind of trade had already taken too much precedence over the more useful exchange of provisions, the captain forbade anyone from buying these articles from them. The following day, the natives returned to try their luck again, but the captain remained firm in his decision not to purchase their garments, weapons, or ornaments, and they had to leave without having achieved anything. This perseverance was all the more necessary and commendable because not even the captain's most insistent explanations, nor his own example, could convince the stubborn sailors that the purchase of such items was detrimental to their health. For the natives stopped bringing fish as soon as they realized that stones, weapons, trinkets, and similar objects were paid better. The greed with which the crew acquired such articles had by now become almost a kind of frenzy, and they did not hesitate to satisfy it by the most despicable means. One group, which had once been sent out with the boatswain to gather broom for sweeping, did not hesitate to rob a poor native in his hut. They took his supply of tools and forced him to accept a few nails as payment, to at least give the theft the appearance of a trade. Fortunately, the natives were bold enough to report this incident to the captain, who punished the offenders accordingly. So it was, to a greater or lesser extent, on all such voyages, and especially the crew of the Endeavour had behaved no better in this respect. In Otaheite, they had stolen from the wife of Tuburai Tamaidi, and in New Zealand they openly declared that all the property of the natives belonged to them by the grace of God and by right. But how should the character of a sailor change when his way of life remained the same every day? Soul and body were equally dulled and desensitized, and even their own commanders constantly complained about the inhuman tendency they had always shown to kill peaceful natives at the slightest provocation. When the New Zealanders saw that they could no longer sell any of their fine goods, they almost entirely left the ship on November 4th. Only one single poor family remained, who, due to the stormy weather of the past 2 days, had not been able to catch any fish, not even for themselves, let alone for the visitors. Georg and his companions found them that day in the so-called Blind Bay, eating a meal of bland-tasting fern roots, with which they tried to still their hunger for lack of better food. In every hut, a fire was burning, filling the whole dwelling with smoke and steam. The inhabitants hardly seemed to feel the discomfort of such air, as they mostly lay flat on the ground. Georg, however, found staying in these huts utterly unbearable. Even though other Europeans had no scruples about going inside for the sake of the caresses of some repulsive women. One might think that only the coarse sailor could not resist this animal instinct. But the tyrannical element on which both officer and sailor were tossed about seemed, in this regard, to eliminate any difference between them. Once things have come so far, that every rising desire, however wild, is allowed free rein, then, in the end, one passion will seek satisfaction at the expense of all the others. The peoples whom Georg and his companions had just recently visited in the New Hebrides and in New Caledonia had very wisely refrained from any indecent intimacies. It was precisely for this reason that the gentlemen now turned with all the greater insistence to the unsightly beauties in the filthy, smoke-filled huts of New Zealand.
Saturday, November 5th, 1774, Queen Charlotte Sound, New Zealand.
On the 5th of November, the weather finally turned fine again. The captain took the opportunity and went with Georg and the others to the end of the bay in order to chart this part for navigation. After rowing for quite a while, they spotted some fishing canoes in the distance, but as soon as the crews noticed them, they stopped fishing and hurriedly rowed away. Since the expedition wanted to ask them whether there was a passage into the open sea at the southern end of the sound, the sailors had to row hard to catch up with them. This was soon achieved, and it turned out that some of the fishermen had been on board just a few days earlier. They were therefore very friendly, and gave the visitors many freshly caught fish. However, regarding the passage, they seemed to understand nothing, so the group separated again to look for themselves. On the left-hand side, they passed a branch of the large body of water, and on the right, several coves. Eventually, they encountered another canoe, which was also called over and questioned. The occupants pointed to the arm they had just passed and indicated that its far southern end led into a bay surrounded on all sides by mountains. Continuing along the route, they indeed reached a very large bay, whose right shore was teeming with people. They landed at the spot with the largest crowd and greeted the leaders and several men who had stepped forward by pressing their noses together. The chief introduced himself as Tringho Buhi, a small, older, but very lively man who behaved in a particularly friendly manner. His face was completely tattooed with spiral lines, which clearly set him apart from the other locals gathered there, who had far fewer of these decorative patterns. The women and girls were seated in rows in front of their huts, and Georg remembered having seen some of them already on board. They seemed much better provided with clothing and other necessities than the few families near the ship. Their garments were new and clean, and some even seemed to have more pleasant facial features than usual among this people, perhaps because on this day they were largely free from paint, soot, or other coverings. Since the locals soon realized how eager the guests were for fish, and seemed themselves keen to get rid of it, the number of sellers kept increasing. Tringho Buhi, however, appeared displeased, as with each new trader, the price of his fish dropped. Some also gave up weapons and clothing, but most were naked, wearing only a narrow strip of woven mat around their loins. This was quite sufficient on such a mild day, especially as the bay was protected from all winds. They stayed on land for about a quarter of an hour, while the number of natives continued to grow. The last to arrive were all armed, and as the group now numbered over 200, more than all the inhabitants of the coves in Queen Charlotte Sound combined, the visitors thought it wise to set off again. Just as the boat was pushing off from the shore, a sailor reported that he had received a batch of fish from one of the locals, but had not yet paid for it. The captain called out to the man, and threw him the only nail he still had with him in such a way that it landed directly at his feet. The native appeared to feel offended, or even attacked, picked up a stone, and hurled it with full force into the boat, fortunately without hitting anyone. After being called out to again and having the nail pointed out to him, he understood the connection, picked it up laughing, and now expressed great satisfaction with their behavior. A little more haste on the sailor's part could easily have turned this incident into a dispute, the consequences of which could have been very dangerous in this situation. For although they would have felt they were in the right, all the bystanders would likely have sided with their countrymen and overwhelmed the Europeans, especially since the ship lay about 9 to 11 kilometers away, and no help could be expected. At that time, they still knew nothing of the fate of Mr. Rowe and his companions. Otherwise, the unexpectedly large number of natives might have caused them much greater concern, especially as it was likely that some of them had personally taken part in that bloody massacre. When Georg considered how often it would have been easy for the New Zealanders to kill the Europeans, for example, when they wandered far from the boats, climbed about alone on hills, roamed through the forests, landed in densely populated areas, and stood unarmed among them, he was all the more convinced that they posed no danger at all, as long as they were left in peace and not deliberately provoked. He therefore also considered it highly likely that the sailors of the Adventure would not have been killed, had they not first grossly mistreated the New Zealanders. In any case, the visitors could count themselves fortunate that, on all their travels and journeys, they had never once encountered a family, or even a single native who was not willing to form a bond of peace and friendship with them, which they never failed to offer. The inhabitants of this bay, just like those whom the boat crew had previously spoken to, assured them that the arm of the sea on which they were now traveling opened into the ocean at its end. So they continued their journey and, after several bends, saw that the body of water continued northward past Grass Cove and East Bay. Everywhere there were coves of varying sizes, along whose shores grew abundant, vitamin-rich herbs, fresh springs flowed, and many waterfowl were found.
At this point, Georg Forster refers to herbs rich in vitamins, though what he actually means are antiscorbutic plants. The term vitamin was completely unknown to him in 1774. Knowledge about these essential substances only emerged much later. Forster and other naturalists of his time were, however, well aware that certain fresh herbs, vegetables, or fruits could prevent scurvy. Scurvy was a dreaded disease among sailors on long voyages, caused by a lack of fresh food. Already in the 18th century, it had been observed that plants like cress, sauerkraut, lemons, or scurvy grass had healing effects. They were therefore referred to as antiscorbutic. No one, however, spoke of vitamins in the modern sense. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that scientists discovered specific, previously unknown nutrients were behind these effects. In 1912, the Polish biochemist Casimir Funk coined the term vitamins derived from vitals and amines. It soon became clear that these were various substances that play essential roles in the body. In the case of scurvy, it was ultimately vitamin C that made the difference. First chemically isolated in the 1920s and later produced synthetically. So when Forster speaks of herbs rich in vitamins, he is describing from the perspective of his time only the experience-based effect against scurvy, without knowing that it was due to vitamin C.
The water was completely calm, the mountains densely and beautifully forested, so that there was no shortage of impressive views. About 5.5 kilometers from the settlement of Chief Tringhobuhi, which consisted of several huts, or a village the locals called Ko Hegi Nui, they spotted some shags with double crests on their heads. This bird species was widely considered a reliable sign of the proximity of the open sea, as it never nested far from it. And indeed, shortly afterward, they saw large waves in the distance, which could only have come from the ocean. To the left, beyond Grass Cove, stood a fortified hippa on a high rock rising from the flat landscape like an island. The fortification was surrounded by tall palisades and appeared to be in good condition. However, since the shoreline dipped inward, they couldn't get close enough to inspect it more closely. In any case, the main objective of the journey now took priority, and they could already see how the sea arm was connected to the ocean. It flowed into Cook Strait. The outlet was rather shallow, no more than 25.9 meters deep and narrow. Just off the mouth lay many tall and dangerous cliffs, where the waves crashed violently, creating a strong current within. From here, one could clearly see New Zealand's North Island, the opposite shore of Cook Strait. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they made this discovery. Had it been possible to sail around Cape Koamaru, they would soon have reached the ship's anchorage again, with little effort. But the headwind made that impossible. Nor did they dare spend the night ashore, as the area was densely populated and its inhabitants were still too unfamiliar to them. So their only option was to row back the same long and exhausting way they had come. After passing once more by the hippa and the village of Ko Hegi Nui, they finally reached the ship around 10 o'clock in the evening, exhausted but safe. Since no one had expected the journey to last so long, they had brought only a little wine or brandy with them. That late dinner was thus the first and only meal of the day. In the map of Cook Strait, drawn by Captain Cook on his earlier voyage, this sea arm had still been marked as a bay, because at that time it wasn't yet known that it connected to the strait. The next day brought foggy, unpleasant weather. But the friendly Piteré wasn't deterred and came to them again with his companions. Captain Cook felt it necessary to publicly thank him for the valuable services he had rendered so far. He therefore called him into the cabin and dressed him from head to toe in European clothing. Piteré was clearly pleased with his new suit, and made it known that he was proud to be held in such esteem. He considered himself so well rewarded by this gift that he didn't even dare to ask for anything more, a rare degree of modesty in this land. In his unfamiliar outfit, they took him along to Long Island for hunting, and afterward brought him back on board for lunch. For someone regarded as uncivilized by European standards, he behaved very properly and with good manners at the table. Georg was convinced that Piteré could indeed sense the superiority of their knowledge, arts, craftsmanship, and way of life, since he enjoyed and was cheerful in their company. Yet he never gave any sign of wanting to join them, and even refused such offers. It might have seemed strange that, despite all the advantages he had experienced, he still preferred the simple and restless life of his people. But Georg had already noted elsewhere that this was the case with nearly all so-called savages, and that even civilized peoples thought no differently. Nowhere was the power of habit more evident than in the way it alone could outweigh the comforts of an orderly life. Toward evening, Piteré returned to land with his companions. His supposed good fortune hadn't made him arrogant, for the next morning he came back aboard with fresh fish. They often heard him and his companions singing on shore, and sometimes they even performed songs on the ship. Music in New Zealand was clearly more developed than on the Society and Friendly Islands. According to Georg, The people of Tanna showed the greatest musical talent among all South Sea peoples, second only to the New Zealanders. A knowledgeable friend, who had already sent Georg a sample of the music from Tongatapu, also provided him with transcriptions of New Zealand songs, from which one could get a sense of the people's musical taste. This friend had never been to Tanna. He was aboard Captain Fourneau's ship, the Adventure, so Georg didn't know whether his opinion of the songs there would have matched his own. But regarding the New Zealand melodies, the friend assured him that they revealed a certain artistic talent and clearly stood apart from the monotonous humming of the Tahitians and the four-note singing of the Friendly Islands. They would sing the first two measures of the melody up to the end of the lyrics, followed by the final motif. Sometimes they also performed the piece in two-part harmony with thirds, except for the last two notes, which were sung in unison. The same friend, to whom Georg owed these observations, also heard a mourning or funeral song about the death of Tupaia.
Tupaia was a high-ranking priest and navigator from Raiatea, one of the Society Islands. He joined James Cook's first voyage around the world in 1769 and played a central role as a mediator between Europeans and Polynesians. Georg Forster mentions him retrospectively in his travel account, since Tupaia had died in Batavia in 1770 and was no longer aboard the Resolution during the second voyage. For Forster, he stood as an example of how essential the islanders' knowledge of language, culture, and navigation was for the success of such expeditions.
The inhabitants around Talaga Bay, on New Zealand's North Island, who held Tupaia in especially high regard, composed this song spontaneously when the crew of the Adventure brought them the news of the Tahitian's death. The words were extremely simple, yet clearly arranged in meter, so that their heavy rhythm reflected the mourner's expression.
Aegi, mate, ewe, Tupaia. Gone, dead, oh woe, Tupaia.
The first outbursts of grief are, by nature, not wordy. The only thought one can express is the naming of the loss suffered, and it inevitably takes the form of lament. Whether the melody matched this powerful simplicity of the text was for better judges of music to decide. At the end, the tones slid from middle C down an octave, as if one were gliding a finger down the fingerboard of a violin. Before Georg left this subject behind, he remarked that, since the New Zealanders possessed a clear sense for music and surpassed many South Sea peoples in this regard, they must necessarily also be capable of noble and gentle emotions, no matter what the subtle rhetoric of a mere armchair scholar might argue against it. He did not deny that they were prone to strong passions, but who would claim that intense emotions always led to harmful or even inhuman excesses? Since their last exploration, they had undertaken several smaller excursions along the coast and visited all the islands within the harbor. This brought them more valuable contributions to the study of the land's flora and fauna than they had expected, given the early season and the many previous investigations. They discovered 10 to 12 previously unknown plant species and 4 or 5 new kinds of birds. Meanwhile, the sailors replenished the freshwater supply, brought large quantities of firewood on board, repaired the rigging, and overhauled the entire ship to once again face the stormy conditions of the southern latitudes. During their stay, the locals had supplied them so abundantly with fish that they were able to salt several small barrels and take them along for the journey to Tierra del Fuego. Prepared in this way, The fish kept well and tasted excellent. Shortly before departure, the captain also had a large number of shags and similar birds shot to ensure a longer supply of fresh provisions at sea. That afternoon, they made their final preparations for departure, and the following morning at 4 o'clock, they left New Zealand for the third and final time.
In Queen Charlotte Sound, relief and dread had drifted side by side, and as the Resolution prepared to leave New Zealand once more, not every story of this harbor had yet revealed its full darkness. You can continue listening right away as the voyage unfolds step by step. If you'd like to follow the route on a map or see how these places look today, you'll find links in the YouTube show notes leading to the website. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.